I'm Andrew Rudd. I showed a film at Salute Your Shorts a few years ago. It was called Safety Net in 2017. And Salute Your Shorts invited former filmmakers, filmmaker alum, to come back and talk to this year's filmmakers as a COVID-19 way of handling a Q&A. So I'm going to try to come up with all the questions that a normal audience would come up with for you and let you talk a little bit about your film. Do not split.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So your film is riveting, and the audience who just watched it knows that the feeling that I had when I watched it the first time, and I just watched it the second time. It's incredible. You put us in the middle of this story that is continually unfolding, and even though we've heard little bits about this on the news here and there, the visceral experience of being on the street and hearing these people so close to our faces is incredible. How did you find your way through the story?
Thank you. I wanted to be as close as possible. In terms of finding the story, the story sort of found me in the streets, because I was always out in the streets following the protests, and I was there with my camera. And after spending some time there, the whole idea for this project was just to be as close as possible. And it was always developing very unpredictable, really having no ideas often what would happen. So in terms of the filmmaking, for me, it was a very physical project. I was following a lot of very young people, taking on one of the most powerful countries in the world. And I was very fascinated by how they were trying to do it. And I was also wondering how it's actually possible to try something like that in that way. So I was really interested in what was going on. I've been working quite a lot covering conflicts before. I used to live in Afghanistan. I was living there for 6 years, and I also worked in Iraq and Syria. And I covered the Arab uprising some years ago. And I was in Egypt, in Cairo, during several periods. So I have quite a lot of experience being in big demonstrations, but I've never been in anything like Hong Kong.
I'm sorry, you cut out just a little bit at the end. You said you've never been in anything like Hong Kong. And I didn't catch what you said after that.
Then I stopped talking.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So what technology is still on our side?
So what distinguishes?
Now I actually couldn't hear you.
Our connection is falling apart a little. Is falling apart a little.
Okay, yeah, because I have problems hearing you now. I can see you when you are trying to ask a question, and then you disappear. Just try again, and we'll edit.
Well, let's try to continue, and hope that the quality gets a little bit better. So, what were the things that surprised you most?
So, what were the things that surprised you most
about the Hong Kong protest?
I think there was definitely several things. I think it was the courage. It was the courage of the young people who were in the streets, taking an enormous risk, because it got more and more intense and also more and more violent. You might be able to see that in the movie, but it was in the beginning you had really big demonstrations, and it could be often you could have families and older people and all kinds of people. But during the autumn or late summer and autumn, it became increasingly more intense and also dangerous. So some of the nights were quite brutal. And I was also surprised by how long it lasted, because it's still going on.
Right.
And it must have been extremely tiring for the protesters. Or I know it was extremely tiring, because it was like, I think there were, during the first 6 months, there were like 1,200 different kinds of protests. So like a lot of things were happening every day. And the protesters had 5 demands. They had like these clear 5 demands for stated, and they really had a very difficult conflict with the government, and none of those issues were solved. So it was difficult to see how the conflict could end. And I think what we have seen over the last weeks is a in direct connection to that, because just at the end of June, national security law was passed in Hong Kong, which have changed a lot. So a lot of the things we have seen in the movie are strictly forbidden now. It's much harsher in that sense today than it was a year ago.
And are these protesters being taken to the mainland to be tried now, or are they still being held in Hong Kong?
As far as I know, there's no cases where any protesters have been taken to the mainland China. But they have had arrests over the last weeks, and it's very unsure what will happen over the next coming months. And there's a lot of trials coming up with the protesters.
I noticed on your Facebook page that you just posted a photograph of the leaf blowers being used by protesters in Portland.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with what's going on in Portland? Are you?
Yeah. I'm following the news. And I'm really struck by how similar some of the pictures are and the videos are from Hong Kong. So I'm sure there have been both direct and indirect communication there, because the tactics are very similar, like even down to the leaf blowers. They use the leaf blowers to blow away tear gas. So it makes sense in the field, but it looks really strange.
It does. I was really struck by some of the visuals in your film that were so incredibly like beautiful and poignant, while also being so dramatic. I mean, the use of the umbrellas, it's just sort of shocking to imagine these kind of flimsy things that we use to keep rain off of us being the only skin between the protesters and the aggressors. But some of the imagery that you were able to capture was just gorgeous, and I want to compliment you and congratulate you on that. But also some of the drone footage that you were able to capture. Do you, as a filmmaker, kind of see some things happening in your daily footage and then try to like develop those kinds of images more? Are you kind of aware of that artistic part of the process while you're in the street? How much is that just natural?
It's a bit difficult to talk about without sounding pretentious, I think, because I'm moving around with my camera all the time. And this was my life for like months, being out in the protest with the camera. So I felt that like the camera was just a part of my body moving around among the protesters. And sometimes it felt like I was dancing in between the whole movement. And sometimes I got shot, so I got back to reality, and that really hurt, like, because you have these rubber bullets and you have these tear gas canisters that I got hit quite a few times, and that really hurt. But I think I obviously I got quite a lot of experience moving around in those protests because I stayed there for a long while and it was happening every day for a long period. So I think I had some ideas how I could move around, but it was also a question of just being ready. Like when you can see they put the bank on fire. I had no idea that that would happen. I just happened to be running together with the protesters who suddenly decided to put the bank on fire. And I think that sort of thing could never have been planned. And they were almost just as surprised as me when they did it, I think. I think it's more a question of being used to filming and film a lot of chaos, basically, and try to keep the camera stable and catch what's happening.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that a lot of people are talking about during the protests that are happening here in the United States is how important it is to think about the implications of capturing people's faces and the ethical kind of dilemma, you know, between bearing witness to these events and the reality that's happening and protecting. Can you tell us about how you think about those things while you're in the field, how you've grown as a filmmaker because you've had so many amazing experiences?
Yeah, there are parts you don't put in the movie because it can create problems. But most of the protesters there have masks. That was the thing all from the beginning when I started filming. So they would have masks both as a symbolic gesture and also to avoid being identified. So I think that made it easier that most of at least the hardline protesters, they have masks. And you have a lot of cameras, surveillance cameras in Hong Kong. So you are very aware that you are filmed from every angle. And that's also partly why they're using the umbrellas. Sometimes they would hold the umbrellas when they were walking in the streets in order not to be seen by the surveillance cameras.
Right. So my next question has to do with like you as a person who's bearing witness to this material and the feelings about like safety and risk. Like, again, you've been in so many places where the risks are very high and the safety is not guaranteed at all. Are there moments still in the field where you feel especially endangered? And were there moments like that in Hong Kong that you can talk about?
I think one of the times where definitely two of the fights at universities, you can see towards the end. It's also when you see the drone footage.
Right.
The first long fight you could see there with the principal standing there when they are shooting tear gas. That was extremely intense, and it was just like constantly flying tear gas canisters through the air, and you had these Molotov cocktails coming from every side in the back. So it was dripping a lot, and some of the people were also caught fire. They got hit by the firebombs themselves. Right. That was very intense, and I broke my nose actually one night. So that, of course, I remember that because that hurt. but I was not surprised when it happened. It was just like more annoying.
So I'm curious about whether or not you experience like post-traumatic stress as a result of some of these experiences that you've had around the world. Like, you dream about these things? Are they things that surface in other ways in your life?
it was definitely intense in Hong Kong, but I felt as a filmmaker all the time, and I felt pretty safe compared to some of the other places I've been. When I lived in Afghanistan, I was close to being killed a few times, both in ambush where I had to run, and I lived very close to a place that was hit by big bombs, actually 2 times. So I've been in much more violent places before. And also when I was filming in Cairo in Egypt, there was a massacre. They killed many hundred people in one day, and then I was out with my camera at that time. I definitely have experienced a lot of sad. I definitely have a lot of sad experiences from the field working as a journalist, but I think it also it gives me a sense of purpose when you are able to show what's happening. So for me, that has worked quite okay, but it's definitely a dangerous part of the job. But I think you also get a bit of a different perspective working in places like this, because you will constantly see that people are in real, basically misery often, and then that also gives you a very clear feeling of how things are much easier for myself. So I think it was a long, complicated answer, but you are aware, and you are also taking the security courses and constantly discuss with other reporters working in the field. But I think for me, it feels important to go out, and I always meet people who have real life problems while I consider myself as a visitor. So that can also be problematic sometimes, but you feel like you are in a place that you try to describe what's happening, and for me it gives meaning, but it can also gives you conflicted feelings working this way.
Right. What gives you hope in your work?
It's a good question, because I think a problem for journalists working in conflict zones is the stories can sometimes be too pessimistic, because I think it's really important to find hope and work on hope. And you can see positive changes, maybe not always on a macro level, but when you see that people who have had real troubles, for example, when I met refugees on the way out from conflict zones, and then I meet them later and I can see that it's going quite well. That's a good experience, because you get connected to people when you work in the field, of course, and so it can be quite emotional, even though I always consider myself as a journalist and documentary filmmaker, but if you only work on the most I'm not answering the question well, but I think it's a bit complicated to answer. But you will always see how strong people are. So people have like incredible strength, and many of us either living in the States or living in Europe, where I'm from, we are not tested in the way that people are tested in Hong Kong or in the places I've worked in the Middle East.
Right.
And then you can really see how solidaric and kind people can be when they're put under pressure. And that gives you hope and that's actually also a very nice experience.
Mm-hmm. That was a wonderful answer. It was complicated, but beautiful.
It took some time, but I think it's a bit difficult because you like this movie that you have seen now. In one way, it's a very physical project, but I have a lot of emotions about what's going on, and it's really a struggle for democracy. It's big human rights issues put to test, and then you have each individual, when you get to know people who are affected in different ways, then you get emotionally involved in another way. It's not only a debate about political rights, it's also the destiny of each individual taking part.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what your next project will be?
Some of them I can't talk about. But the next that will be published is about refugees in Europe.
Okay.
So it's a project where I'm looking into the situation for refugees in Europe today, because I covered the several periods earlier, and we had the situation in 2015 and 16 where more than 1 million people came to Europe from the war in Syria and from other conflict zones. Then it was a very big debate in Europe about how to handle the amount of people arriving. It's a bit similar to the discussion about Mexico you had in the States. And a lot of countries started to close the borders. So it became much more difficult to enter the continent. So I've been filming over the last 3 years, meeting refugees in different parts of Europe. That will be published soon.
Good. Thank you for spending some time with me. I am grateful for the work that you're doing in the world. It is so meaningful to feel much more connected. In your film, I felt more connected to what's been happening in Hong Kong than I ever did. And I've cared the whole time, but it's not as easy to feel empathic and human in my connection to the protests as it is when I was on the street looking through your eyes and your camera. So I'm grateful. And congratulations too on the film has gone to a lot of big festivals, and hopefully it's finding a wider audience, even though we're all quarantined in various places. But hopefully that means more people will have time to watch it.
Thank you for the kind words, and I'm happy to be a part of the festival. Good luck with the rest of the festival.